there, fantasy owners. Welcome to Lift the Cup Fantasy, or LTC Fantasy as some people call it. We're continuing along with our 21-22 team reviews, and today we're going to look at the Nashville Predators. We'll take a look at who led them in different stats for goaltenders, defensemen, and forwards. Who's their biggest fantasy disappointment? Who is their biggest fantasy surprise? And who on the roster was relevant fantasy-wise on a weekly basis? And also take a peek at some streamers there. These videos continue to come out couple times a week here, because no better way to spend the fantasy offseason than watching the playoffs and talking a little bit of fantasy hockey. Don't forget to subscribe. That way you can catch your favorite team's review. Maybe you want to check out your rivals' review, or maybe you want to catch all 32, which would be nice. Or you just want to take a peek at a team that sometimes gets overlooked fantasy-wise. So we'll get right into it. Goaltenders, it was basically a one-man show on UC Saros. He led him in games played at 67, ton of games. Led him in wins at 38. Goals against average was 2.64, and his save percentage was .918. I don't know going into the season if the plan was to play Saros quite that much, but they really showed a lack of confidence in Riddick, and that really led to Saros playing a lot of games. He played well, extremely well for them. So, yeah, he was definitely fantasy relevant this year. Jumping into defensemen, can't say enough about Roman Josi. Man, did he have a season. He led the defensemen in goals at 23, assists at 73, and points at 96. 96 points for a D-man. That's huge. Alexander Carrier led him in plus-minus at plus 26. Mark Burowicki led him in hits at 196. Roman Josi led him in blocks, obviously because he seemed to be on the ice for 59 out of 60 minutes. 133 blocks, and also led him in shots on goal at 281. Again, as I mentioned, Josi had one hell of a season this year, putting up 96 points. At one point, they haven't seen these numbers since Bork played in the league. That's how good he was this year. He was just absolutely incredible. You can't say anything more about the season that Josi had. Up front, looking up front, who led them in goals? It was Matt Duchene at 43. Assists was Mikael Granlund at 53 assists. Duchene led him in points at 86 points. Should mention with goals in 43, Forsberg did have 42 goals, so just behind him, and played in 9 fewer games. Plus-minus was Philip Forsberg at plus 12. Hits was Tanner Genot at 318. Like, wow, what an amount of hits. His shoulders have to be sore in the offseason here. He also led him in blocks at 64, so a nice amount of blocks for a forward there. And Matt Duchene led him in shots on goal at 228. So Duchene this year did have a career year. He's never had 86 points in a season before. Forsberg also had another good season, putting up 42 goals. Granlund and Johansson both had some nice numbers this year. Nice offensive season anyways. And it's kind of weird. We used to talk only about defensemen in Nashville, and now you're seeing some forwards that are really becoming fantasy relevant. Biggest fantasy disappointment for me was Eli Tolvanen. He was a highly touted prospect. Last year was his first year full-time in the league. He put up 22 points in 40 games played, and they're expecting him to take a step forward this year, and he really did regress. He only got 23 points in 75 games this year, so he did drop off, and I think Tomasino's passed him on the depth chart there. Biggest fantasy surprise? Honorable mention has to be to Matt Duchene, because he did have a career year putting up 86 points. But how can you not mention Josi as the biggest fantasy surprise? Yes, you know he's a stud on defense, but 96 points from a defenseman, that surprises anybody. If you're not surprised by it, I want you to pick my lottery numbers there. I just don't know how you're not surprised by it. Relevant on a weekly basis, players for them. Obviously, Saros, he plays a ton, gets you wins, everything you need from a goalie. Roman Josi does everything and more. He puts up forwards numbers in a D-man spot. Up front, Duchene and Forsberg are definitely fantasy relevant on a weekly basis, especially the season Duchene had this year. Streamers, there is some nice options for him. You got Mikael Granlund, Ryan Johansson up front. Sometimes on the back end, depending on light nights and that, you could look at Ekholm or Carrier. They did have some nice stretches there where they put up some decent amount of fantasy points. Hope you did enjoy today's episode. If you did, please remember to hit like, hit subscribe, and remember that notification bell. We'll be out in a few days with another one, and enjoy the rest of the NHL playoffs, fantasy owners.